What does it all mean? It's about onion.
Home of Mythvision podcast and Mythvision radio group. My co-host is Derek Lambert. I'm Dr. Luther G. Williams. You won't see Derek live this evening. We tried to euhemerize him. Some think he's just a myth, but we tried to pull him into reality. We weren't entirely successful tonight. Anyway, folks, we are on Facebook. Easy to find and just as easy to like us. YouTube, we're live over there, so you can like us. You can subscribe, share, comment, contact us, will you? And today we've got a show that has been much in demand. You all came out to pack the Mythvision strip club and watch Dr. Richard Carrier effectively disrobe both historicism and mythicism. So while these two seductive ladies are competing for your attention, how about slipping a 5, 10, or 20 under their G-string and let us know you're enjoying the show. Now, come on, our PayPal and Patreon are sashaying across your screen. And now, about today's very special guest. Richard Carrier is a PhD in ancient history of philosophy from Columbia University. He's an accomplished writer in atheism, philosophy, ancient history, and many other fields. His books include Sensing Goodness Without God, Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, and the one we'll be discussing and focusing on tonight, on the historicity of Jesus, why we might have reason to doubt. His website is richardcarrier.info. Just run all that together, okay? And from there, you can connect with him on Twitter, Facebook, and most importantly, Patreon. And you can help him out with that Patreon at www.patreon.com/Dr. Richard Carrier. That's Dr. Richard Carrier. His books are available in print, digital, and audio formats. Just go to www.richardcarrier.info/books by Richard Carrier. And he also does affordable online courses at www.secularactivism.org. And there are other ways to help and support his work, and they're all listed at richardcarrier.info/support. Also, you'll want to check out his publicity page at richardcarrier.info/publicity. Now, all these links, in case I messed them up, and I probably did, but you'll find them in the description of the video, so you can check them out, okay? So today, we're going to be talking with him about his magnum opus, at least I consider it to be, on the historicity or lack thereof of Jesus. Please welcome Dr. Richard Carrier. Richard, how are you? Good to have you here.
Huzzah! Very happy to be here.
Man, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Really, really great work, man. We love you. We love keeping up with what you're doing. And this book is a chunk of change on the historicity of Jesus. Fantastic job. I give you kudos. Lots of people talk about the book, but you wonder how many people have really gotten in depth with it. And that's what we hope to do tonight. Derek sure wishes he was here, but I'll try to uphold the integrity for both of us in getting down to the questions he would want to ask, you know. One of the things that comes to mind, probably the first thing, is that you think there's a serious bias in historical scholarship, one that threatens to undermine the whole scholarly enterprise. What is it that the historicists are doing that maybe they shouldn't? And what are they not doing that maybe they should?
Yeah, I've started to notice this more and more. I mean, of course, I already started noticing it when I did the first book, Proving History, where I, in this project, I basically were doing a postdoc research grant project. It's essentially a second dissertation, and it resulted in a lot of works. But the first thing that you do when you have a project like that at the PhD level is you do methodology. So you work out what are the methods being used in this field, and so on. And I found that the methods were bonkers, really. They don't really work. And they have a certain sort of intuitive feel to them, but they don't really hold up logically. And they're not methods that are actually used in other subject fields of history too. And when I did finally check this, I found that like everyone who did a study of these, so there's several biblical historians and scholars have written articles, peer-reviewed articles or books or things just dedicated to studying these methodologies, and they all find fault with them. Like none of them say that they're really, yeah, these are great methods, let's use these. And yet the historians keep using them. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. One is, if you're going to do origins of Christianity, now it's different if you're doing like 3rd century, 4th century Christianity and so on. We have a lot more sources for that. But for 1st century Christianity, the source situation is terrible. Not only do we have hardly anything, we have nothing that's actually from the actual events of Jesus' life. We have no eyewitness documents and so on. But in addition to that, the documentary record's been hugely doctored. Like there's a huge selection effect as to which works were preserved, which works were even mentioned, and also doctored. There's like more forgeries. There's more forged gospels than there are gospels in the New Testament. More forged epistles than there are epistles in the New Testament. So there's rampant doctoring of things. We have lots of examples of trying to sneak passages into the Bible and things like that. So it's a really, really vexed subject, more than any other subject we have. And so I think, there's two ways you can confront this. You can admit that, well, this kind of limits what we can know for sure. We just have to admit uncertainty and a lot of doubt and room for different theories to be true. We really can't solve the things we want to solve. Or you can come up with a bunch of bogus methods that look like they get you to the truth. So you say, we're going to extract some facts out of all this. There's got to be something that we can affirm and base our careers on.
Right,
confidence.
of course.
And so there's this need to have some tools that will do that. So they basically convince themselves that these tools work, but they don't really. And they never really like tested them out on other fields either, or to see like where they do work and don't work and what you need to get them to work. So that's one thing. But another thing I've noticed, especially lately, after my book on the historicity of Jesus came out in 2014, which is the first book in 100 years specifically on the question of historicity to pass peer review. And it's the first one ever to argue that there probably wasn't a Jesus. So it's really a consensus challenging work. Mm-hmm. The hostility to the book has been rather extreme. I mean, there have been a few scholars who've appreciated it and said that it's a respectable argument and so on. There's at least 12 significant scholars, and I name them all now and keep a going list on my Bart Ehrman recap article on my blog. There's at least 12 of us now that are either on board with it or agnostic at least, or at least think it's plausible. And so that's happening, but it's still a small number of people. Most of what you see, even there's been a few like journal articles criticizing it, they don't really engage with the argument of the book. They often like misrepresent what's in the book and make absurd arguments. And one that you run into all the time, I just was, I'm writing a shorter pop market version of this. So I was recapping the chapter on what I call the argument from Spartacus. And this kind of really illustrates the whole issue. The argument from Spartacus goes, basically, but if you were going to doubt the existence of Jesus on the evidence we have for Jesus, then we have to doubt the existence of Spartacus because we have way less evidence for Spartacus than we have for Jesus. That's the argument. And then you point out, as I do, I have an article on Spartacus on my blog, that in fact we have vastly better evidence for Spartacus. That in fact, if we had for Jesus what we have for Spartacus, this would be a no-brainer. We'd say, yes, there was definitely Jesus, right? So it's the fact that we don't have that actually makes Jesus a doubtable character. Which shocks me, and if it's not Spartacus, it'll be something even more ridiculous like Alexander the Great, or something a little more plausible like Pontius Pilate. There's a bunch of these, and in my article on Spartacus, I linked to them all, and I've done articles on all these or done things on it. It's just not true. We have more evidence for all these people. But the fact that these are PhD historians, sitting professors, we have an example of E.P. Sanders, for example, renowned scholar.
Okay.
Renowned scholar in this field. He's the one who infamously said that we have better evidence for Jesus than we have for Alexander the Great. And that's fantastically absurd. I mean, it's wildly false. And that's the one I talk about on the historicity of Jesus. I go through, and it's an unfair comparison as well. I mean, obviously, if Jesus was a relative nobody, we should not expect to have that much evidence for him as we have for Alexander the Great. that would be a fair argument to make. But what they say is that we have more evidence for Jesus than we have for Alexander the Great. There's no justification for an actual sitting professor in this field to make such an absurd propagandistic argument like that and do it with such confidence. I can only assume that he didn't even check. Like, he didn't actually research what do we have for Alexander the Great and how does it compare with what we have for Jesus. I don't think he's being dishonest. There are some out there who are dishonest and know there's more evidence than a lie about it. But I think scholars like Sanders, like, they just are so desperate to believe in a historical Jesus and so desperate to dismiss any suggestion that he didn't exist, that they'll just jump to insane hyperbole like that and put it in peer-reviewed books and peer-reviewed journals and things. There's no way that would happen and be tolerated in any other subject field. So that there's clearly some sort of drive, this need to really circle the wagons on this and bolster it up. Now, why is that? I mean, I don't really understand it exactly what the what the motivations are. I mean, the Christians you can explain because they need Jesus to exist.
Right.
And some secularists, of course, they get their money, their standing, their students, their buyers of their books from religious audiences and so on. So that I can see there'd be something there. But there's got to be something else going on. There's some need to not let this infiltrate the ivory tower. And I don't really know.
It's almost as if there's a direct repudiation of good methodologies, as if they don't want to go into it. And what you've done in this book, because it's so tight methodologically, is to have something that's serviceable for both historicists and mythicists. And that's what I love about it. So, hey, historicists can benefit from it just as much as anybody else if they will actually follow the protocol.
Yeah. And even as I say in the book at the end, like even if you disagree with the method, well, give us another one. Show us a method. Show us that it works. Show us that it works
Right.
on something other than Jesus, right?
Yeah.
A valid analogy, someone who's, comparable in status of evidence and things like that. Show us it's a valid method. Show it has logical validity and so on. Give us another method if you don't like this one. Now, I think anyone who tries to do that is going to end up finding that the method that I develop is the one you end up with all the time.
Okay. Right.
And I really show that in Proving History for people who want to look at historical methodology. In Proving History, like in chapter 4 of Proving History, I go through all these like standard descriptions of historical methodology that have been proposed in the field, not in Jesus studies, in history in general, like by other historians. And I show they all reduce to Bayesian reasoning. They're all based on different ways to get at the same, basically, engine, the same vehicle of logical construction. So it's really the same thing all the way down. And then I have chapter 5 in Proving History is on the weird method specifically developed for Jesus studies and why scholars say they don't work. And then I show the logic of it. Like here you can see, you can analyze the logic of this, why this does not function the way that you think it does. And so for people who are interested in that story, that's Proving History. Once I've worked out the method in Proving History, I just apply it on the historicity of Jesus. So I don't argue for the method there. I just use it. And anyone who follows it there should I often say, all you need is 6th grade math. It's just 6th grade math. If you can do that, you can figure it out. And you don't even really need the math per se. You just need to know greater than and less than, basic concepts of probability that don't even require putting numbers in, but putting numbers in is a useful way for you, and I think anyone, to really test out why do you believe what you believe and what underlying assumptions do you have to rely on to maintain those beliefs.
I mean, it's I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, yeah, absolutely. That's the lesson I think people can learn from it.
Well, I think you're right. It's just simple principles of convergent validity, finding different ways to measure the same thing and then finding the same way to measure different things, getting in there at the different measures and comparing them. I think it's very thorough, but for some reason, scholars just avoid it. So one of the things they complain about, Bart Ehrman complains about this, and while I have a chance to say, what is it like to have this exchange that I haven't checked it out myself, but that I understand exists between you and him on both your blogs? Is that still going on freely, or is he hard to hook up with?
No, he's
hard to get.
He's given up. He refuses to debate me. Yeah, he won't debate me. He doesn't even like talking about me. Like, he will avoid even discussing it. He's refused to read the book, flat out. So he just won't. So, you know, and I was really hoping that he would be the one who could write the best rebuttal to it, like the most honest, well-researched, and not fundamentalist, apologetic, but genuine secular scholarly version of it. So I could say, yeah, read On the Historicity of Jesus, and then read this other book so you can compare them. It's the best case for each, and then you could weigh it and figure it out yourself. But he didn't do that. I'm very disappointed.
Wow.
And he seems stalwartly disinterested in doing that. He's not going to go back to it. He's not going to explore this any further. So if we're going to have that, we've got to get it from some other historian in Jesus studies. I'm still holding out hope that someone will do it.
Yeah, well, hey, hope springs eternal. You know, something he does criticize pseudo scholars about is calling themselves mythicists when they don't define what's meant by a myth. However, you take great pains to do that in the book. So what is meant by a figure being a myth? Give us a little insight.
Yeah. Well, that's another example of, like, you know, taking this seriously as a research project. If you're going to say something's a myth, like, check the literature. What do historians of mythology say myth is? Like, and we have anthropology, we have history, we have literary studies, we have a lot of scholarship on myth. What is myth? And, you know, it's different angles you can look at it, but myths are generally stories told as if they're literally true, but they aren't. Right. So myths usually represent things. A really classic way to look at it is the parables that Jesus teaches are really mini myths. Right. They're, you know, they lack the particularities. Right. You know, he's not giving people specific names in his parables, but he tells a story like, oh, this guy did this thing and this thing happened. He doesn't mean that really happened, that these people really exist. No. He means that you're supposed to understand the structure of the story, the moral of the story. What is the point here? What is the symbolism here? It all represents things about social systems, things about cosmic systems, things about the nature of the universe, communicating it through allegory, through the telling of stories. And that's what myth is. So if you're a mythical person, if you get to a particular kind of myth, like Hercules or something, there are many other examples that you can call upon. There are famous ghost stories in the ancient world about, you know, Lady Philinion is a classic example that got converted into a different story set in Ireland, you know, 2,000 or 1,500 years later. It's the same ghost story, but they changed the names, they changed the location, they changed everything to make it fit the context of, you know, late medieval Ireland. And it's the same, but it's the same story, right? You know, it's not historically true, even though you've got named people, they've got family. You know, there's like, how could that's got to be true? Why would they invent? No, they did that on purpose because they're taking the structure of the story, which communicates things, values, and ideas about people and gender relations and things. And then they just transfer it into a familiar context by changing the names, changing the historical setting, and so on. So Jesus is very much doing that. They're doing that with Jesus. When they're writing the stories of Jesus, let's take Mark, for example.
All right.
Mark is and Matthew even more so makes Jesus into a new Moses. But even Mark is doing it. So like Mark is rewriting stories about Moses, completely redoing them to sell a different message, but it's using the same symbolism, the same idea. The stories are the message. You're not supposed to take it literally. Or if you are, you're an outsider, and the insiders will snicker at you, and that's the whole point. And you have Mark even says this. He has Jesus say this outright. The parables are told to outsiders so that they won't understand. But insiders are going to be told the secret. And what does he mean, the secret? He means the meaning of the story, the moral of the story, which means he doesn't expect the outsiders to get the moral of the story. They think it's just a story he's telling about something that happened, right? And so that is in Mark 4, and that's a key to the entire gospel. Mark is really telling you that that's his whole gospel. You're supposed to look at it the same way, that the whole gospel is a parable.
Wow.
If you take
John Dominic Crossan said
yes, Power of Parable. That was his book on this. It's really good, by the way. I'm not a John Dominic Crossan or John Dominic Crossan.
Dominic Crossan.
John Crossan. Anyway, I'm not a fan of his generally. I don't agree with a lot of his conclusions and methodologies, but he gets this one right. Power of Parable. He gives examples, and this is what he does. This is why he gets it right.
Okay.
He goes outside Jesus studies, looks at other ancient literature, finds these analogies, like in writings about Julius Caesar and things like that, And then
now, Richard, we're going to plug your book now. Tell us the name of Crossan's book one more time. Things got garbled when you said it. Okay.
Yes, The Power of Parable.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. It's a good read. It's a short read, but he does the methodology right, where he proves that it works outside Jesus studies, then he applies it to Jesus studies, and that's why it works basically. But it's the same idea that myth is meant to look literal. It's meant to look like a regular story. It might have fantastical things in it. It might have improbable things in it, but that's not the point. If you're reading it literally, you're missing the point. Myth is really about what is the underlying message here. What are the ideas that we're communicating? What are the structures we're trying to symbolize and so on? So
wow.
That's mythology. And we have many examples of it in biographical form. We have the myth of Romulus is written in historical biographical format. So we have like Plutarch's Life of Romulus. It's written just like a historical biography, 100% mythical. There's no history in there. So you can't look at myth as a genre. Myth can be represented in all genres. It can be represented in poetry. It can be represented in prose. It can be represented in history. It can be represented in, fable is another classic example. So
okay.
Anyway, for people who want to know more about this, I have a whole section on it, citing the scholarship, the experts on myth studies and so on. It's in chapter 10, 10.4, chapter 10, section 4 of On the Historicity of Jesus.
You sure do. And so at the risk of taking all of what we read literally, Ehrman also believes in the likelihood of an historical Jesus as an apocalyptic faith healer, one whose divine attributes were added in time to become the theological and liturgical Jesus that we know about. And it seems like neither of you really believes in a miracle working human being. So it's like you have that in common.
Yeah.
Is Ehrman then making that concession? Is he giving up ground to mythicism by saying, well, I don't believe he did miracles either, even if he exists?
Well, of course, Christian apologists would say that's exactly what he's doing. I mean, I wouldn't be unfair to him to say that too much. He does keep giving ground more and more. Like lately, one of his recent books, not his latest, but his recent one is How Jesus Became God. And in that book, he finally comes out as admitting that the first Christians believed that Jesus came from outer space, basically, that Jesus was an eternal pre-existent being who lived in the heavens, descended to earth, became incarnate, taught people, and then reascended to heaven. And it's very clear that that's the case. I mean, it's right in Paul. Paul talks about it frequently.
Right.
Definitely the earliest Christians did think that. Even if Jesus existed or not, they thought that. And so that's where Ehrman is now. Now, he used to deny this. He used to be someone who says, no, he would attack mythicists by saying, oh, they think this cosmic Jesus thing started at the beginning, but no, that was a later belief. Well, now he's given ground and admitted he's looked at the research and said, well, okay, actually, yeah, the research holds up. He was believed to be a pre-existent being, cosmic being all along. But he doesn't see that as arguing for mythicism. He just sees it as reconstructing his historical theory. And I have to say, his theory is probably the most plausible of all of the historical Jesuses. There's many different historical theories of what Jesus was or who he was or what he did and how he got himself killed and so on. Ehrman's is a plausible one. And I think, like, if Jesus existed, then Ehrman's theories are probably the hottest on the heels of the truth. That's what's going on.
Cool. Cool.
And I say I give it a 1 in 3 chance, actually. So it's actually a respectable probability. And that's, a lot of people don't know. In the book On the Historicity of Jesus, my final conclusion is highest odds for historical Jesus are 1 in 3. A lot of people don't realize that I actually give it that high in odds. But still, it's below 50-50, so that's too low for most people's tastes. Anyway.
Now, those odds, by the way, are not manufactured, and I've heard you say that countless times on shows. Folks, there's a real basis when Dr. Carrier says 1 in 3. And so we want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of it. People say, well, how did he get that number? The Rank-Raglan scale, what's it all about? Let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts of the book's methodology itself. What is Rank-Raglan, and how did you use it?
Yeah, so one of the things you want to ask is, so we know Jesus was heavily mythologized. So you take Bart Ehrman and myself, we both agree that's the case, that he was a heavily mythologized person. Even by the time he gets into Mark, he's already heavily mythologized. So the question you want to ask is, well, how often, if you look at all the people who've been that heavily mythologized, you set everyone else aside and you just throw into a hat just the people who were as mythologized as Jesus, what percentage of them turned out to not exist? Like, how many of them can you say probably existed? And that would give you what's called the base rate, or the prior probability. This would say like usually, let's say it turns out to be 1 in 3 turn out to be historical. Let's say that's what you find. 1 out of 3 of these people that fit this set, 1 out of 3 of them might be historical at best. That's really pushing it, probably a lot less than 1 in 3, but we're going to say it maxes out at 1 in 3. If we say that, that's what we're saying is like, that's the base probability. Now you could have specific evidence, independent evidence that shows that this guy you're looking at is an exception to the rule. So I've used the example of Julius Caesar. He's actually not in this set. He's not as mythologized as Jesus. Even Alexander the Great was not as mythologized as Jesus. But even if they were in that set, and you could say, yeah, 1 in 3 chance out of the hat, they existed. So you'd say 2 in 3 they didn't. But then you bring the evidence in, it's for the specific person. So we'll add on top of that, what evidence do we have that Alexander the Great is an exception, that he's actually not the 1 in 3, that he's actually more likely to be historical? And there's tons of evidence. That's when you bring in the evidence, and then his probability goes way up. So you start with the base rate, but that's not your final probability. The base rate is just what's usually the case for people like that. And then you throw in the evidence and see, does the evidence get those odds up so that we're back into historicity again? And for like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, clear and away. And also for Spartacus and everybody else. So Spartacus was never mythologized, but at least not in this way. So the question is, how do you figure out who's in the hat? So how mythologized was Jesus? How do you measure this? And that's hard to do because Jesus is so mythological. He fits like a dozen different myth sets. And you can look at them all, and they're all fairly small sets, or they're sets where it's ambiguous the rate of historicity. But there's only one of these sets that he belongs to has a relatively large number of people, and it's about 15 members. And we can actually determine that there's definitely, you can reasonably say there's no more than 1 out of 3 of them who are historical. So you can actually get a usable statistic out of this. Now you can make a reasonable argument that none of them are historical, which gets you to, you can do some math, it gets you to 1 in 16 chance or something. That any new person in this method, or a new person in this set, would be historical. So that gets you your errors of margin, right? Somewhere between 1 in 16 and 1 in 3. And that's just your prior. You're not done yet, but that's just going right out of the gate. People who are that mythologized tend not to exist. And so that's something that I think historicists don't want to admit about Jesus, is that, Jesus belongs to several sets whose members tend not to exist. So that leads us to suspect maybe Jesus didn't exist. But it doesn't answer the question finally. So we can get his probability up if we can throw in some evidence in there that changes it.
All right.
That's when you get to the next step, looking at the evidence particular to Jesus. So when you mention the Rank-Raglan scale, there are these different scholars throughout history, Otto Rank and Lord Raglan, noticed that there was this one particular myth pattern that's very commonly found. Not every member has every feature, but if you rate it, there's like 22 features, and if you look at all the members who score above 11, right, now there's more than half. So everyone who scores more than half, they tend not to have existed. It's about 1 in 3 at best, right? It's probably less than that, but you can't get any higher than 1 in 3 odds. So this actually let me to use this as a set. It's the most useful set because it has the largest amount of people in it, members of it, and we can get a usable statistic out of it. But even if you try to argue that Jesus is wishy-washy whether he fits in the set or not, there are all these other sets he fits in that are also high rates of non-historical people. So you can just keep piling this on, and it just makes you more certain that Jesus is definitely in a high myth set, regardless of whether it's Rank-Raglan or whatever. It's multiple sets. He belongs to them all. So he's definitely a high mythologized person. And you can definitely argue that high mythologized people tend not to have existed, regardless of whether you go Rank-Raglan or whatever. Rank-Raglan just gives us some hard data that we can work with to show this. But even if you're not going to use that, you still end up in the same place by looking at how mythologized Jesus was. So you have to look at the evidence, and that's when things fall apart, because the evidence for Jesus that shows that he's an exception to the rule is not strong, and that's it's not as strong as claimed. And this we get to that point about when they claim it's better than we have for Alexander the Great or Spartacus or whatever. It's not, and that's the problem, and that's where this sort of brutal honesty needs to come into the field and admit yeah, actually the evidence sucks. Let's just be honest about that starting out. And if Jesus is highly mythologized, and highly mythologized people tend not to have existed, and we don't have really good evidence to change the conclusion for Jesus, why are we so certain Jesus existed? That's the question that people really need to be asking themselves, who are in this field and have the PhDs and are really looking at the evidence and so on.
So taking off from the prior probability, you then entertain these twin hypotheses in the book, and I look at them as the twin towers, right? And that is, we assume that the historicity of Jesus is true, and we look at the evidence, and that's one hypothesis, and simultaneously we then look at the opposite hypothesis, which argues for minimal mythicism.
Yeah.
And the difference between those two would be the weight. Let's say we might say the weight of probability in favor of one hypothesis or the other. So
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's you, and of course people should realize, and people who haven't read the book might not. I don't even consider the supernatural Jesus hypothesis. It's so improbable. It's not even on the probability map, right? So
right.
I'm only comparing like the most basic historical the secular, mundane, he was a real guy who got heavily mythologized version of Jesus. That's the competing hypothesis. I really take it seriously, and I ask, is the evidence we have the evidence we would have if that were the case? How likely is it? How expected is it? How unusual is it? How unexpected is it?
Right, right.
But if you're going to do that, you have to do it the same for the other thesis. So I take minimal mythicism, which means I strip away all these elaborate mythical theories that people have about the Jesus myth. There are many different scholars, some cranks and so on, have these really elaborate theories. Just throw all the elaborations away. Just get rid of all that. Just cut it down to the bare minimum of what it means. What is the most minimum plausible origins of Christianity without a historical Jesus? And so these are the two. These are steel men, right? Steel man of historicity, steel man of mythicism.
That's right.
Two strongest hypotheses. Let's compare them. How do they compare in terms of how likely the evidence is on each theory? And to do that, you have to like literally put yourself in the mind of saying, okay, what if it was true? Let's just assume it's true.
Yeah.
That Christianity started with visions, and this Galilean ministry thing was invented decades later. Let's just assume that's true. If that's true, and then all these other things we know about the history of Christianity and the history of the time and so on, how likely is the evidence we have? It's actually pretty likely. It's kind of almost what we'd expect to have, including the missing stuff, because a historicist sect gained control of all document preservation. So we wouldn't expect to have like early documents. Like we know there were letters of Paul that we don't have. Why don't we have them? Could it be that he actually is very explicit about the non-historicity of Jesus? It possibly says something that's really alarming. Historicists don't want that, so that letter doesn't go in. They're not even going to talk about it. If they declare it a forgery or whatever, it gets gone. It doesn't even enter the record. We don't even have a mention of it. That kind of thing. So we can't expect to have those smoking guns, because those smoking guns would have just been shuffled into the sand, right? So there's a lot of these things we can look at the background evidence. We can say, yeah, the evidence actually comports pretty well with what we'd expect to see if Jesus didn't exist. And even when you look at the epistles of Paul, how weird they are and what's in them and so on, how late the Gospels are relative to the kinds of documentation we usually have for significant charismatic leaders and so on. So there's that. And then you do the same thing on the other side. You look at, well, if Jesus was this charismatic preacher who gained a large following, how well is the evidence what we'd expect then? And it doesn't fit very well. Now, I look at it also from two sides, like the really skeptical side, like being a proper, like a scientific doubter. And the evidence, when I look at it that way, the evidence really doesn't fit a historical Jesus. I think it's very unexpected. It gets a low probability from me. But I've got to control for my bias, right? So I look at both sides of the equation. So I look, okay, let me look at it with the eyes of a historicist and say, let me not make those assumptions. What's the best I can really weigh this evidence? Like that's the most reason, like the furthest I can go without like basically letting my brain fall out, right? How far can I go and still be reasonable about it? Right. So I get a different result. And so I have, for instance, I count certain passages in Paul that are contested as to whether they indicate a historical Jesus or not. They're ambiguous and so on. I actually, on the upper side of my error margin, I count them in favor of historicity. I weigh them 4 times more likely on the historicity hypothesis than on the mythicist hypothesis. But you have 1 and 3, but then you have 4 to 1. They almost cancel out. You end up roughly in the same camp of about 1 to 3 chance to use. So even having the evidence is 4 times more likely on historicity than on mythicism is not good enough evidence to overcome the prior probability. So, and then there's some other evidence goes in there. You know, there's Acts has some weird stuff in it. There's some other evidence, the external evidence has some problems. And there's some other things in Paul's letters that pull it back, right? So there's so once you put it all in, you end up with 1 and 3, not like 1 and 2 or something like that. But so when you put all the evidence in, you get there. But even with being most favorable possible to the evidence. So anyway, if you want to see how the math works out, there's tables in the book and all of that. There's only a few pages of actual math in it. But if you really want to do the math or look at the math or put your own numbers in, it's in there. So you can actually use that apparatus if you want to.
Okay. And the organization is tight because I think in chapters, I'm not sure they line up this way in the hard copy, but in the audio book, it's chapters 8 through 11. I guess it would be the same.
Oh, and
so you're looking at these 4 categories of data. You're looking at the book of Acts, you're looking at external evidence, you're looking at the Gospels, and you're looking at the letters of Paul. So just to remind everybody of what we're dealing with, those 4 sets. So you bring up an interesting idea in chapter 22, and that is the book of Romans and 1 Corinthians portrays Jesus as the antitype to Adam, while the Gospel of John and the Epistle to the Hebrews depict him as the antitype to Moses. And given Jesus's close relationship to Adam and Moses, how might their status as either mythical or historical impact that of Jesus? I mean, you know, he's another Adam, he's another Moses. What are we talking about?
In a sense, they're proofs of concept, right? So Moses isn't, you know, mainstream scholars now agree Moses is probably mythical. So they told myths about Moses that look very similar to the stories about Jesus. In fact, the Jesus stories are built around the skeleton structure of the Moses stories. Moses had family members, he had sisters and so on, brothers. So, you know, people say, but Jesus has named brothers and sisters. Well, so did Moses. You know, so do lots of mythical people. Like that doesn't really tell you anything. That in and of itself is not helpful. So they are proof of concept. Adam also is another example. I think pointing that out is it doesn't really weigh any further than we already have. We already know Jesus is heavily mythologized. So adding that in doesn't really increase the probability of mythologization of Jesus. It just further confirms what we already know, is that he's a highly mythologized person. I think pointing out the Adam and Moses thing is much more of a bee in the bonnet of Christian fundamentalists, right? Because Adam and Moses, Adam especially, you could definitely argue, is definitely mythical. Moses, probably mythical. But the Bible, you know, the Gospels have Jesus walking around and talking like Adam and Moses were historical people. So clearly he didn't know, right? So if you're gonna say that this is a historical person and we have an accurate record of what he was saying, this is a guy who was just a regular schmo who was ignorant of the fact that Adam and Moses were mythical people. There's many other things in there. I've pointed out in a debate with David Marshall once that there's a passage in Mark 7 where Jesus goes in this elaborate rant on why you shouldn't wash your hands in dishes because that's a stupid human tradition. It's not in the scriptures. And he says, no, nothing bad can happen to you from that. Only like things that come out of your mouth and enter your mouth with, you know, it's psychological things, only things that harm you.
Right.
But clearly the guy who said that, it probably wasn't Jesus, but, you know, even if it was Jesus, didn't know about germs. Didn't know to say like, oh, you know what, actually, by the way, you know, how half of all your kids die before they reach adulthood. You could probably put a dent in that if you really spread this tradition of washing your hands in utensils.
Yeah. Apparently he didn't know much about the Levitical priesthood either, who washed their hands obsessively, you know?
Well, he probably did.
Even in your own culture,
Right. Yeah. No, he did. He was blaming that on a tradition of man and not a commandment of God. But the whole argument tells you that this is a guy who doesn't know about germs. He doesn't really know about antiseptics and hygiene procedures and things like that. So, you know, that's just an example of how it really does destroy fundamentalism. But that could, you could say, make it plausible that he's historical. But the thing is that people who are making up the stories about him are also have the same ignorances. They also don't know that Adam and Moses were non-existent. They also don't know about germs and so on. But at the same time, the earliest ones like Mark and Matthew, they're writing mythology. They don't care if Adam and Moses are real. For them, it's all symbology anyway. So if Jesus is just a symbol, or if their gospel Jesus is just a symbol, of course, they believe in a real spiritual, angelic Jesus who lives in heaven and really did descend, really did acquire a body and was killed somehow in some supernatural realm and so on, according to the mythicist thesis. So it's just the Galilean Jesus storyline that they think is mythical. But they could be fully compatible with their belief that Adam and Moses were mythical and symbolic and so on too. We don't know that's the case, but it wouldn't like be impossible. We have examples like Philo of Alexandria is very wishy-washy on whether Adam is a real person or Moses is a real person. He sort of categorizes them as historical, but he's really strongly emphasizes that they're mostly just symbolic characters. And you have this in Paul too, when in Galatians 4, when he says Sarah and Hagar are really just symbolic characters. He doesn't outright say they never existed, but his point is like you're supposed to interpret the scriptures symbolically. Don't take this literally. It's not a literal Sarah and Hagar. That's not the point. You're missing the point if you're taking it literally.
Right.
So we know there were Christians and Jews who read the Bible this way, and it was completely compatible with the way they can interpret things. But that would be true for both historicists and mythicists. Each theory is compatible with this reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mythicism really permeates everything. I'm thinking about, and I just wanted your thought on this, Margaret Barker's temple theology thesis that contrasts the first temple tradition with the second temple. And she talks about hearing and seeing God as being part of what they did in the first temple tradition, noting that, originally God was not only heard, but he was also seen. But then in the second temple tradition that emphasized the law, God was only to be heard, so he could be obeyed. Then Jesus comes along, and there's kind of, for her, a restoration of the first temple tradition. So now we not only heard from the prophets, but now Jesus is seen. So what's this thing about any thoughts on God in the time of Jesus now being not only heard, but once again seen? And what is the implication of that for mythicism and historicism?
I don't think it affects the debate between historicism and mythicism. For people who don't know, Margaret Barker is this extremely erudite scholar who wrote several books on Temple Judaism. And they're just chock full of really excellent, deeply researched Jewish lore and Talmudic teachings about the temple cult and so on. I don't always agree with all of her theories, but she's just a goldmine of data. And has some really thoughtful, interesting concepts in there. Like she's done work on Miriam's well, which was this sort of moving well that, and Moses struck the rock and water came out. There was a extra biblical lore that was actually a rock that they carried around that followed them around the desert, and it was called Miriam's well. It had a name. Miriam, of course, by the way, is Mary. That would be the same name as Jesus' mother.
That's
also
right.
The same name as Moses' sister. Probably not a coincidence, just saying.
Right.
But, because, if it's Miriam's well from which flows the water of life, it's Miriam's womb from which flows the water of life. You see how there's the symbolism they're playing off there.
Right.
Plays off of Jewish lore that's outside the Bible. So the Christian Gospels and their mythology is not just based on what we have in the Old Testament today. It's based on scriptures that are not in our Old Testament today. It's based on scriptures that said different things than our scriptures today. And it's based on lore and beliefs that beyond that, a lot of which is lost, some of which we can recover. And Barker is one of these scholars who tries to collect the ones that are still floating around and we can still get data on. But yeah, her idea is like, you look at the Old Testament, God is a thing you see, like column of smoke, a burning bush, his literal backside. Moses gets to see his ass, apparently.
Right. Yeah. Right.
There's an
I'm
actual,
not sure I would put it that way, but yes, that's exactly right.
Well, there's one of the patriarchs literally has a wrestling match with God. Like literally he meets him on a road and fights him.
Yeah.
So there's definitely this seen and heard aspect. And then when you get to the Second Temple period, then or even before that, just there's a switch right around the period when you get to the age of the prophets. Now you only
Right.
have God speaking through prophets. You don't get to hear God directly anymore. It's only spoken through prophets. You don't get to see God. There's no burning bushes anymore, no columns of smoke. And that goes on for a few hundred years. And then, then you have the idea of the Christian. You got to think of the earliest Christians as a Jewish sect. They were Jews. They were a splinter sect. There were dozens of these splinter sects. Many of them are very similar to Christianity. And so they're all these fringe cults. Christianity is definitely a fringe sect of Judaism. It's not a mainstream sect of Judaism. A lot of people like to try to criticize this, like, what the Jews would never do that. And it's like, well, you're talking about conservative Jews, not fringe Jews. They actually have lots of examples of fringe Jewish sects doing exactly the things that you claim that Jews would never do. But anyway,
Yes.
So
That's true.
Christianity fits into this box, the same set of things. And so it would make sense for them to actually sort of eventually envision a return to the Old Testament concept of you can see this divine being. Now, of course, it's still, and I guess the most literal version of it is when the Transfiguration in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus, radiates his glory so that you see the true angelic being underneath the flesh, the mortal flesh, and so on.
Mm.
But of course, the Gospel authors, it's not until John, before John, the Gospel authors are still preaching the same thing Paul did, which is that Jesus is not literally God. He's an archangel. He's the first archangel, and he's assigned the powers and authority of God. So he's sort of like the equivalent of God, but he's not identical to God. He is an actual agent whom God sends down to do stuff for him. It's not until John that you start to get this idea that Jesus and God are one and the same. And even then, it's a little uncertain what he literally means, because there's similar ideas of emanation theory in Judaism and so on. So, but before that, no, it was Christianity. Jesus was not God, but he was God's viceroy, and he was a celestial being. He was a spaceman. An immortal, super powerful spaceman who was just wearing a bodysuit, like a spacesuit, except a terrestrial Earth suit, an environment suit, if you will, that would eventually, they'd cast off. He would die, and its blood would atone for the sins of Israel and all that. So you do have this return to seeing the divine glory, and it's even literally mimicking seeing. So you have it's on the mountain where the transfiguration occurs, where Jesus' radiance is seen. And it's just like Moses ascending the mountain and seeing the radiance of God. So they're these deliberate parallels, like this is not a coincidence. So I do think there is an attempt to recapture the glories of the old way of telling stories and the old way of conceptualizing gods and divine beings, and then just rewriting the stories in just such a way that it fits the new context and teaches the values that they want to teach, that they're not exactly in alignment with the Old Testament values, or at least
That's right.
Objectively, they think they are, but they want to tell the stories in a better way so they can communicate how their values differ from other Jewish sects and how they're interpreting their texts.
And as you argue in the book, we ought to pay more attention to these differences. Everybody wants to point out the similarities, but it's the differences that really confirm for us how that particular writer or redactor is using the material and the point they want to make. I think that's a great point.
That gets overlooked a lot. And to even tie this in to what I mentioned before about the ghost story, Lady Philonion gets turned into this Irish ghost story later on, right? So they update the story. They change the location of it and time and space, new names, slightly different changes to the story to fit the context and so on. This is just what the gospel authors did with Moses and Elijah. They relocated it in time, made Jesus the central character. So now it's in, 1st century Judea, not, 6th century, whatever, 12th century, it doesn't matter, BC. They've changed the location. They've changed the names to fit whatever message they want to say, the context. They've changed the values they want to communicate. So the changes are important, both in making it more familiar to people, but also if you're going to slightly change the message. So if you look at the Lady Philonion story, originally it's a 1st century Roman fable. You look at the Irish story, there's differences in how the stories play out that reflect different views of how marriage and society and genders relate. And so the changes are communicating. So they basically have this Irish, whoever came up with the story, liked the Lady Philonion story, but didn't like the value structure behind it. So they borrowed the story, updated it, and made the tweaks they needed so the story now fit the values that they want to communicate. So the differences, the way they change the story, are actually the clues not only to the fact that it has been borrowed, that this transvaluation has happened, but also it's the clue to what the message is. Like, what is the author really trying to sell us on here? is what has he changed? And you want to look at that. Like, how does Jesus differ from Moses? That's really important because that's the point of the story. Like, how does Jesus differ from Elijah? Really important to the story. And you can see like how Jesus communicates and represents compassion. It's compassion versus arrogance is very, very different, stark contrast with Elijah as a character. So you're supposed to agree more with the way Jesus does things than the way Elijah does things. The Elijah story was considered a little too stuffy, not really the kind of role model that we want. Not perfect, not quite the role model we want. We want to like update the role model, tweak it a bit to make it a better role model. So then they just did it with Jesus, basically. And you can look at the comparisons of the stories, like the different, like when Jesus resurrects the girl. That's a story that's really lifted from the Elijah tales. And
right, that's Jairus's daughter.
Correct. Yeah.
Asleep. Okay.
Yeah, in the Jesus version, it's Jairus's daughter, but it comes from some stories in Elijah as well. But yeah, you can see the structural differences, the behavioral differences. Those are all the points. The new message that's being sold with this stuff.
Wow. You make all these points as I go by in the book. By the time I got to the conclusion, I'm going, have I read that before? Because I mean, you dropped enough gems along the way that, good Lord, I feel like I could work on a dissertation on just the things that you dropped. The breadcrumbs are so fantastic, you know.
Yeah, that's true. There's so many threads in there that could be explored into full books into their own. Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about back when we were mentioning Margaret Barker, and you mentioned the names, how they play into a story, or nomatology, the study of names and their forms. These names, they're really important, aren't they? And not many of the mythicist scholars I have read, there are some, but not many pay as much attention to those names and actually translate them and see how they play into the telling of the story. You do. You've given that some attention in your book.
Well, and not just me. A lot of the examples, I do some on my own that I think were overlooked, but a lot of the examples I use are actually in the literature. Like that, mainstream scholars have already gone over this ground in a lot of cases. It's quite apparent to them that a lot of these names have symbolic functions. Nicodemus, that means victory of the people. And in the Gospel of John, Nicodemus is the guy who's on the side of the common people, right? He's exactly. a member of the elite who basically defends the commons. And so it's very convenient that he's called Nicodemus, victory of the people, right? So, yeah. And of course, Nicodemus is clearly a made-up character. He doesn't appear in any of the previous Gospels. It's a really weird name for a Judean to have, and so on. And the things he does are improbable, like not realistic, and so on. So it's a really classic example of a mythical character. Looking at the names is key. And so an example of one that I've caught that I think other scholars have overlooked is Joseph of Arimathea, right?
Oh, okay.
For years, decades, a century more, there's been this hand-wringing about where is Arimathea? No one records this existence of this city. We have no idea where it is or what it is. And so there's a lot of like theories about, well, maybe it meant this, maybe it meant that. Similar sounding names of towns that aren't quite a fit, but roughly close. But actually Arimathea, as it's written in the Greek, means best disciple or best teaching. And in fact, the way it's written, it sounds like best disciple town or best teaching town. Essentially, it's a really classic example of a mythically constructed name. Because here you have Joseph, a name of a patriarch, right? The father, essentially.
Right.
Joseph, from the place of the best disciples or the best teaching, is the one Jew who obeys the law and gives Jesus an honorable, or not an honorable, but a proper burial in accordance with biblical law. Even condemned criminals who were executed had to be given a proper burial. They didn't have to be given an honorable burial. It didn't have to be with their family. It could be criminals' graveyard, but they had to be buried before sunset. God is very specific about this in Deuteronomy. Even convicted criminals who are executed, they must be buried. They can be displayed. You can hang their corpse or whatever during the day, but before sundown, they better be in the ground. And Joseph is the only one of the council, or only one of the elite Jews who actually comes and does his duty. And the different gospel authors talk about him, how he wished for the kingdom or how he was a secret disciple and so on. giving away the clue that they're aware that this is basically a symbolic representation of the best teaching, the best, what it is to be the best disciple is to act like this guy. This is the way a Jew should be, right? So it's this. The town is made up, right? And it's symbolic, and it's supposed to communicate to you this secret meaning. And we have lots of examples in authors like Origen and Philo and so on who do this with biblical Old Testament characters to say these names are symbolic. Here's how they're constructed, what they mean. So we know that was a way when names were constructed back then, or a way people believed names were constructed back then. So, and we see it in other myths too. It's very popular in mythologies to have very conveniently named people. The famous example is, I think, Adam just means man. Abraham means father. So it's like or father of many. I think Abraham means father of many. And then he gets his name when he is declared to be the father of many, the future infinitude of the Jewish race and so on. So, the use of like these sort of fake names that have symbolic import is already in the Old Testament. It's a well-known practice. But it's also in pagan mythology. It's in mythology all over the place. It's very common. Yeah, go ahead.
I was saying, and some of those names dovetail. The same names you find in pagan mythology, you find in the New Testament. Like the name Aristarchus, you find in the book of Acts, which means the best ruler, at a time when Paul is preaching the gospel.
Yeah, and the one that people miss a lot is Bartimaeus, right? Bartimaeus the blind. That means Bar Timaeus. Timaeus meaning the Timaeus of the Platonic dialogue.
Yes.
So this is Bartimaeus means son of Timaeus. So there's probably some lost symbology there. I don't know what it is exactly, but I'd have to go. It's something that someone could do and go read the Timaeus, the dialogue of Timaeus by Plato, and see is there a play on blindness in there? Is there a connection here where the name means something? Because as it is, son of Timaeus is just a weird name to run into in the middle of Galilee, right? It's not impossible, it's not like it couldn't happen. It's just a highly suspiciously weird name, right?
Yes.
So there's got to be something going on there.
Wow.
A lot of examples. I think even so I'm gonna make this point. Like, oftentimes people will cite who's the Christian apologist? I can't think of his name right now. Who argues that the frequencies of the names in the Gospels match the frequencies of real name frequencies in Judea at the time, and therefore, is it Bauckham? But there's this Christian apologist who's made this argument. But he's wrong, actually. His data doesn't line up. If you actually look at the names in the Gospels, they're actually weirdly out of alignment with reality. Now, he wanted to argue that there's no way a myth would come up with the correct name frequencies that would match historical reality, and therefore that's evidence that it's history. But he's completely wrong. Actually, the name frequencies don't line up. To give you a really classic example, Jesus is one of the most common names of the time. It's Joshua. Right. There are no other, no one ever meets a second Jesus in all the Gospels. Even in the book of Acts, the only person they ever meet named Jesus is like way out in Crete or something. He's not even in Judea. So, and there are other examples. There's really common names that appear nowhere in the Gospels. And then there are names in the Gospels that are weirdly rare, but happen more often than they should. And so the actual statistical lineup does not match that. Actually, what you see is the only names that come close to lineup are the names in the Gospels that are key characters in the Old Testament, right? So you have, or Old Testament or important Jewish legends. So you have like Joseph and Jose and similar names, and you have Mary and Salome, and you have all of these. These are names that have real deep mythical significance for these authors, and are really common names in the Bible. And then the other ones like Simon. Simon is a really renowned name in the line of Jewish high priests of the temple. So Simon has really deep resonance as well. Just for people at the time, it did. Like, we don't see that because we don't see histories of the high priests of the temple in the Old Testament, but this is viscerally aware. These legends and this reality is something that they were very aware of when they were writing. So Simon was a very resonant name, a very important name to have a zillion of. There's a bunch of Simons and it was a common name at the time, but still, there's a bunch of Simons in the Bible, very peculiarly, coincidentally, in fact. So you have like Mark, you have Simon Peter, right? Who's, named the Rock, Peter. So, but he's Simon. But then you have, Jesus says to Simon Peter at one point, he says, you're going to have to pick up your cross and follow me, right? There's that famous line. And then, of course, in the end, what does Peter do? He runs away. He has this falter, and of course there's a hint that later he'll be redeemed, but when Jesus comes to visit him and whatever after his death. But what happens is suddenly there's this other random dude, Simon of Cyrene, a different Simon, and what does he do? Really coincidentally, picks up the cross and follows Jesus, right? So that's a kind of coincidence that doesn't happen in reality, but really, really is characteristic of myth. So there's some symbolic point here. Simon of Cyrene represents something with respect to, he's an antitype of Simon Peter in certain respects. So, once you get this, you start to like, oh, this is really clever fiction. And it is really clever fiction.
Yes.
And I think people who take it literally, who aren't willing to accept that this is actually all symbolic fiction, it all has deep meaning, are missing out, really. They're missing out on the point of the author. And of course, a lot of the deep meaning is lost now because it would have been communicated in private, in secret, sworn to secrecy, and so on. It would be the insiders, the initiates who'd be told
That's right.
their deep meaning of these things. And so if it didn't get written down, a lot of it's lost. Sometimes you can reconstruct it. Sometimes it's told to us in extant writings. Like Origen actually does know about the Barabbas narrative being the Levitical goat ceremony. It is the Yom Kippur ceremony being replicated there. And he talks about that. So he's aware of the fact that Jesus Barabbas and Jesus Christ are antitypes of each other. And they both represent the two goats in the Yom Kippur ceremony. One is like thrown to the people to carry their sins, and one is sacrificed to atone for their sins. It's total mythology. And you can look at
right.
The story is massively implausible as history. No such ceremony existed. Pilate was not going to let some murderous rebel go free because of some custom of letting people go free. There was no such custom, and so on. But you look at the structure of it, it's the Yom Kippur, it's all this atonement ceremony being mashed in and merged with the Passover. So it's all the symbolism just packed in there. Origen got it and admitted it. And I've noticed when I did my research for it, I got it. I figured it out myself. And so one of the things you do is you go check the literature. Has anyone else figured this out? Am I the first dude?
Right.
And I found two other scholars in different points of history who had also discovered this and wrote articles on it, but they didn't know about each other. So I count as the third person to independently arrive at the same conclusion, which to me tells, that's a really good confirmation that we're definitely onto something. We're not just making this up.
Right.
We all saw this independently. And then, of course, you add Origen. Now that's three, and that's an actual ancient Christian. So, you know what I mean? So
yeah, you can't, because you can't beat a three-legged table. Right? There's your convergent validity again.
Absolutely.
And if people are not attuned to these meanings, even scholars, then they miss a lot of what's going on. They'll say that, that wasn't characteristically Jewish. Jews didn't think that way. But as you point out in the book, the Jewish people were not monolithic in their thinking about theology and religion. And you say this very well in the conclusion. You point out not only was there syncretism as kind of a natural function of the conquest by these nations, Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, but also their theological creativity was the product of their wrestling with this existential defeat by these nations, because that was the question they had to solve in their minds. How the hell did this happen to us, right? In other words, myth served as an important function for the Jewish psyche in the Second Temple period and beyond. And that makes a lot of sense to me. The way you put that across in the book, I thought was excellent.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they were supposed to be the master race, right? God said they're going to rule the world, and they keep getting conquered. And so you have to come up with excuses for this. I have for those who like amusing and educational and informative talks. I have one. If you Google around for Wichita Rapture Day, Richard Carrier. Back in Rapture Day, back when Harold Camping predicted the end of the world was going to happen on a certain day. I don't remember what year that was. It was sometime in 10 years ago or something. On that day itself, Wichita an atheist group out there had a conference and had me give a talk. And so I chose to give my talks. The title was "You're All Gonna Die," and the subtitle was "How the Jews Kept Failing to Predict the Apocalypse and Caused Christianity Instead." And what I do is I go and I show that it goes all the way back to like Jeremiah is struggling with this. Like, how do we explain our defeat and stuff? And it's like, well, you know, we just have to get right with God, and there's have to be like, we have to stop sinning and so on. And eventually, in a certain prescribed number of years, and he gives a number of years, God will come back, or God will, you know, deliver us and make us rulers of the universe and all of this stuff, and it'll all be good eventually. Now, his timeline failed. It didn't happen. So the authors of Daniel write this little passage in Daniel 9 and say, well, like, where Daniel's like pleading to the angels saying like, why did Jeremiah's prophecy fail?
Yeah.
How could that be? And the angel says, oh, no, you misinterpreted it. Let me do the math, redo the math for you. And this is really convoluted math to get the Jeremiah prediction to work. And now, of course, it's predicting that it's going to happen right now, which would be for them like mid-2nd century BC. They expected,
right.
There were this big revolt. The Jews were rising up against their Greek conquerors. This is the time God's going to come and vindicate us. And so these people forged this prophecy from Daniel to really sell people on this movement, saying, look, here's the prophecy. It reinterpreted Jeremiah. You know, so it wasn't a failed prediction at all. It's going to happen now. It's going to happen now. So join our fight, and so on. And then it didn't happen, obviously, you know. So now you have this other failed prophecy. So you have later, because they just can't abandon Jeremiah and Daniel. They can't say they're false prophets. So the later Jews have to look at them. We must have misinterpreted something. So they keep trying to reinterpret Daniel, do the math differently. And so you see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, trying to recalculate the math, trying to figure out different dates that are predicting the end of the world when God's finally going to vindicate Israel and his people. And Christianity arises right in the satellite of these predicted repredictions. So Christianity is actually one of them. So it is one of these Jewish sects who is trying to reinterpret the failed prophecy of Daniel, who is trying to reinterpret the failed prophecy of Jeremiah, all of which trying to explain why Israel is not the ruler of the world. Right? Yes. And so by the time you get to Christianity, their message was, it's the same thing. Like, yeah, our guy is going to come back. He's going to kick everybody's ass, and then we'll be kings. Then we'll be wearing crowns, and he'll be in charge of everything. But it'll be the new Israel. It'll be the real Israel, the real chosen of God, because all these other Jewish people have just abandoned God. They're sinning, and they're corrupt, and so on. And so they had this idea that there's only like a true core new Israel that would be resurrected and saved. Originally, it would just be Jews, but then Paul comes along and says, no, Gentiles can be in on it too. And then it just became super successful because, you know, once you could join this really, you know, exciting apocalyptic family cult, I should say fictive family cult, without cutting off a piece of your penis, then it was very exciting.
Lots
of people would join.
That's right.
Yeah, so the Gentile churches grew at a faster rate than the Jewish churches did. This is how Christianity became predominantly Gentile. And then eventually became anti-Semitic after the Jewish wars, because it was easier to get sympathy from the Romans if you do the whole, well, no, we hate the Jews too.
Yeah,
we're not with them. We actually don't like them. So we're actually with you.
Yeah.
And that was basically the origin of modern anti-Semitism was built out of that sort of strategy. It's kind of like the Southern strategy in Republican campaigning, right?
Right.
To try and find... Let's find a race to rag on. Yeah. but that's what happened, actually. That's Orthodox Christianity pushed away from Judaism and went very anti-Semitic and went, you know, gentilized the religion. And from there, you know, then it's splintered into, 30,000 sects of Christianity?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Even when I read the roots of that in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, I have to laugh. You know, we are called Christians. We're no longer called Jews. So when Emperor Claudius puts everybody out of Rome who's called a Jew, that's not us. We're training in Antioch and we're Christians, you know?
Yeah, right.
Oh, boy. I like what you say in the book about about your being able to figure out a religion like Christianity based on your knowledge of the times, your knowledge of Judaism. And I think you're spot on with that. All these national cultures under the Roman umbrella were integrating these mythical ideas. And so you ask the question, you say, what would a Jewish mystery religion look like to the educated, privileged classes? And that's really who put this together. So I think that question is framed correctly. And you have several planks of such a religion. First, there'd be worship of a mythical, historicized savior figure, right?
Yeah.
There would be a death and a resurrection. Very common theme. There would be salvation for those who commune with his spirit. Okay. And you say, well, what else can I put in there? Well, the founding of some sort of a brotherhood. Okay. Through baptism. Yeah, that's it. Baptism, a water ritual, and the sharing of sacred meals, the stuff. So how could it be anything other than that? Right. So as I key in on that, I am tempted to add to it the motives. For example, it would be syncretistic. Hey, that makes sense. But also, it would be perhaps politically neutered. What do you think about that? And even if we did not go so far as to accept a Roman provenance theory of the Romans being responsible for the New Testament, would not such a religion be pro-Roman in sentiment? What do you think about that as we construct it?
Sort of. Now, notice it's not pro-Roman in the sense that they were defending the Roman Empire and its structures, but it's pro-Roman in the sense that it's pacifistic and compatible. Their whole idea is let's create our own society within the existing society without opposing the existing society, right? So they're really setting themselves apart from the zealot approach, which is let's just fight these motherfuckers, realizing that leads to nothing good. The Romans always win. If you're going to do that kind of fight, they're going to win. But let's just be peaceful, and then we will realize the reforms we want to realize, but we will realize it in our own communities. And of course, they expected the world to end anytime soon, so they didn't expect to overthrow Rome or any of that stuff. God was going to do that for them, right? Okay. Their idea was that, and I think Paul especially really thought this. I think that's why Paul wanted to pull the Gentiles in. He wanted to create a religion that would unify Jews and Gentiles so that it would end conflict. We could basically say, look, there's this law-abiding, peaceful religion. We're all one brotherhood. There's no reason for war or conflict or oppression or any of this stuff. We're going to pay our taxes. It's all great. No reason for the Roman authorities to really be worried about us. Now, of course, reality is there's tons of friction and problems and so on. But that's not what they thought, right? What they thought was, this is a great idea for reforming society. We'll do it from the grassroots. We'll reform it from the ground up rather than trying to topple a leader and reform the world from the top down, because we've seen that doesn't work. And I have a whole section on the historicity of Jesus in chapter 5, where I talk about the political situation really makes sense. It makes sense to go to the spiritual solution specifically to try and create a peaceful reform of society. And one of the analogies I use is the whole anthropology of revolution cults. We have the cargo cults being a famous example. There's the ghost dance movement. We have a variety of these movements that really track the political situation of Christianity and what Christianity tried to do to solve it. And it is very similar to the syncretism. It's to create some sort of a pacifistic or at least nonviolent attempt to unify the conquerors and the conquered religions and create a new whole that is a new, more powerful religion that will reform the morals of the members of that religion, but also make them compatible with the existing regime, so they're not rubbing in friction with the empire. That was the original idea, and people run with it and ended up going in different directions with it. And it doesn't quite end up where they wanted, but that was their idealism. That's every idealistic movement's been like that, right? They have this utopian idea, like the Marxists. We have this utopian idea: if we just do it this way, everything will be great and wonderful. And of course, reality turns out completely differently.
Yes,
what they predicted. The Christians, it was the same way. They had this utopian idea, if we could just get everybody on board with this new way of doing things, it'll solve all our problems. and then it'll be great, and then God will come down and save us all, and then we don't have to worry about anything. And so that was their idea. And it was very idealistic. It was very unrealistic, but it is what they thought. And I think that's very much what Christianity represents.
Yeah, I'm thinking about theories of 9/11, and if you're familiar with conspiracy theories, there's the MyHop theory, the LIHOP theory.
Hang on.
Yeah. Hey, yeah. Hey, you okay there? All right. We got it. All right. Okay, MyHop and LIHOP in relation to 9/11. LIHOP, LIHOP, let it happen on purpose. Did the government let it happen on purpose?
Yeah. Okay.
MyHop, did the government make it happen on purpose?
Sure. Okay.
So given these compatible communities, that was in the interest of Rome also. Would there be a role of sponsorship or promotion or license or sanction or something like that on the part of Rome? If we say that they didn't write it, that they're not directly responsible for the literature.
Well, we don't have the documentation we need to answer that question.
Okay.
By the time we actually start hearing from Romans at all about Christianity, I mean, the first Roman to ever mention Christianity is Pliny the Younger in 110 AD. And by the time he's mentioning it, they are an unlicensed religion. They're actually, he's basically prosecuting them for illegal assembly.
Right.
Not for their beliefs. The beliefs, there's no law against that. He didn't care about their beliefs. I mean, he thinks their beliefs were weird and problematic, but they weren't illegal. What was illegal is that they were meeting and they didn't have a license from the state to meet. And all other, like Jewish synagogues had licenses from the state. All other religions, temples and groups and so on. Even firemen, and this is the example that Pliny also mentions in a separate letter, even to have a firehouse with firemen who assemble for the purpose of waiting around to fight fires if something happens, you had to have a license from the state to assemble. Otherwise, it's illegal assembly. They think they're doing something political. They don't want that to happen, and it's a crime. It's very close to treason to assemble. So it isn't the content of the ideas. It's the assembly that's the thing that the government fears and outlawed. And so when Pliny is prosecuting Christians, he's just treating them like an unlicensed cult. They could have just sought a license, right? So what we don't really know. So we don't have letters from this time from Christian churches explaining why they didn't just form a legal association under the Roman Empire. There's no. Now in Pliny's province, it was much more difficult to make that happen. So maybe that was the reason, but we don't hear it from them, right?
Right.
We don't hear it from any other province either. It's like, why weren't Christians just legally licensing themselves like other religions did? And we don't have that. Like, did the Romans refuse? Did they try? You know what I mean? We don't know. But the one thing we can say is that there's certainly no Roman sponsorship in the terms of like the Roman government itself. The Roman government sees these as outsiders that haven't been licensed. Now, maybe there had been some licensing in the first century that we don't know about. And I toy with that idea in some of my blogs, but we don't have any evidence of it, so we can't really comment on it. So we don't know. Now, would there have been wealthy Romans interested in gaining prestige and clientele by sponsoring one of these new hip cults? Well, yeah, I think that's probably likely. I think the houses that were the original churches that people met in were the houses of wealthy people. Maybe not necessarily aristocracy, but people of means, probably, very successful, wealthy artisans, for example, people of that class. May have been some aristocrats eventually. We don't really know, but it's definitely not a top-down support. It's when you get to like the upper elite, like the Roman Empire, the emperor himself and the Senate and so on. They had no fucking idea what Christians were. Like they was just off their radar. Pliny, right. Pliny didn't even know, and he was one of the highest-ranking, most legally experienced Romans of his time, and he literally didn't know what they believed. He didn't even know why they were illegal. So now, of course, maybe it was different earlier on, but we just don't have the evidence to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pliny. You were referencing Pliny's letter to Trajan, and I think there were a couple of other references.
There's two letters that matter in Book 10. In Book 10 of Pliny the Younger's correspondence, Book 10 is all his correspondence with Emperor Trajan, which is roughly around 110 AD, give or take. Mm-hmm. And they're very far apart in this correspondence. There are two letters. that don't reference each other. But one is about the firemen's associations, and where Trajan says, no, I'm not allowing, that province is recently rebellious, I'm not allowing even fire associations, even firemen's associations, I'm not allowing. Now, completely separately, Pliny starts talking about the Christians. He writes to Trajan, I don't know what these guys are guilty of. How do I treat them? We can tell that he's treating them ultimately for a legal assembly, and for treason, in the sense that they wouldn't engage in an act of worship of the genius spirit of the emperor, which he interpreted as rebellion, as like refusal to, basically like spitting on the emperor, like, oh, okay, we know what you're about, right? So
right.
That's how he interpreted it. That isn't how the Christians meant it, but that's how he interpreted it. So for him, it was a political thing. It wasn't a religious thing.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question for you. Let's get into some textual questions.
All right.
You do not give credence to the anonymous Q document as the gospel source of Jesus' teaching. Why not? Tell us.
There's no reason to believe it exists. So let's fill people in who don't know. So
okay. All right.
So there's what are called the synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning seen together, which is Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And they're called that because they have identical material between them, like verbatim. Some changes, but almost entirely verbatim. So they're basically redactions of each other. And a lot of this material is just Mark. So Matthew just copies a bunch of Mark. Luke copies a bunch of Mark. But there's also material shared between Matthew and Luke verbatim that's not in Mark. And so the question is, where did that come from? Is it Luke just copying Matthew? Or was there some other gospel, like a second Mark that's lost, that they're also copying from, both Luke and Matthew separately? And that was the hypothesis. I don't remember when it was formed, early 20th century, I think. That hypothesis was formed, and they just gave that hypothetical lost gospel the name Q, which is Q for Quella, because in German, these are German scholars who first came up with this. Quella means source, so they're saying the source. So just generic source text. So they called it Q. And so the Q idea is that there was this hypothetical lost gospel that contained this material that is pulled out and shared by Matthew and Luke. That's not in Mark. Now, there's tons of things wrong with this hypothesis. Mark Goodacre is the best to read. He wrote a book called The Case Against Q. The Case Against Q by Mark Goodacre. Highly recommend reading it if you're interested.
All right.
In biblical textual analysis. He's a good writer as well, but also knows his stuff. There's a lot of other writings on this and articles and so on, but the problem is that you don't need it. You can just say Luke copied Matthew, right? Like you don't need a third source,
okay,
or fourth source, I guess, or whatever, second source, depending on how you're counting it. You don't need that. And actually, there's evidence. We can actually prove fairly conclusively that Luke did copy Matthew. There's a lot of material that Luke borrows from Matthew that only comes very distinctively from Matthew. Even like material that Matthew gets from Mark, Luke sometimes uses Matthew's version of it. So there's definitely, that's what's happening. So we know Luke used Matthew. We know Luke knew Matthew. Even when Luke doesn't quote Matthew verbatim or copy Matthew verbatim, he rewrites Matthew in obvious ways. So like the nativity stories, there's tons of contradictions between Matthew's and Luke's version.
Yes,
but the contradictions are they're so highly coincidental. It's impossible. Well, I wouldn't say impossible. It's just highly improbable, put it that way, that Luke isn't deliberately rewriting Matthew. And to give you an example, there's this author. This is from a scholar that I cite on the historicity of Jesus somewhere. Who I can't remember his name, but he first analyzed this and noticed that Luke is reversing all the criminal aspects of Matthew's narrative. So in Matthew's narrative, the family of Jesus are outlaws. They flee legal authority. No, literally, right? They flee. Well, yeah, Herod the king, because the legal authority is looking for them. They flee the country.
That's right.
So they're basically outlaws. They run away. They're not going to Jerusalem like good pilgrims every year, like, being, obedient Jews and doing the proper ceremonies every year like they're supposed to do, or at least like the best of Jews would do. Luke doesn't like this. Luke wants to sell the narrative that Christians, even from the very beginning, even from the family of Jesus, were law-abiding citizens. And that's a very consistent theme throughout Luke and Acts. Whoever wrote Luke wrote Acts as well. Very consistent theme is that the Christians, we are law-abiding citizens. There's no reason for the Romans to be after us. And in fact, look at all these examples where the Romans actually backed us against the Jews. It's those it's those meddling Jews that are always like, trying to break the law and stuff like that. That's literally the theme of Luke Acts. So when you look at the nativity, what happens? He has a decree of Caesar declares the census, and Josephus dutifully obeys the decree of Caesar to go be counted in the census. So right out of the gate, the family of Jesus is law-abiding, not outlaw. They're not defying the law. They stay in Jerusalem the whole time. Every year, it makes a point of saying they go back to Jerusalem to do the ceremonies like good pilgrims every year, very faithfully. They never flee. They're never outlaws. They're always law-abiding citizens who out in the open in the whole deal. So the things that Luke has changed, he's changed deliberately because he doesn't like the message of Matthew. Even though Matthew's version is very Moses. Matthew's version is very Moses, right? It's very much Pharaoh in the basket, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which is Jewish. Why, right? And Matthew is written by a Jewish Christian. He's written by a Christian who does not like the Pauline Gentile sect. He thinks Christians need to be proper Jews with the circumcision and dietary laws and the whole thing. So Matthew is a Jewish Christian, a Torah observant Christian. So his Jesus is very much a Moses, a recapitulation of Moses, a new Moses, a better Moses, right? But Luke doesn't have that mission. Luke is definitely a Gentile, or at least a pro-Gentile Christian. He wants the Gentile church to be authoritative. He wants the two wings, the Torah observant and the Gentile churches, to get along. And so he fabricates and does revisionist history to make it like they've always been buddies all this time. And we know that's right. Not the case.
That's right. Catholicizing. He puts
right.
Them
so he's trying. Yeah, exactly. Right. It's all bogus, but he that's the message he wants to sell. It's his propaganda. So Luke doesn't want that message. He wants this law-abiding citizens message. So he uses different things. So he tells a different story. He rewrites the thing completely. He just can't use the material. There are some quoted lines that are almost verbatim between Luke and Matthew. So it's not like he didn't, use exact material, but he rewrites things because Luke wants a different message. He wants to tell a different story. So that part, but he's clearly doing it based on Matthew. He's reversing things in Matthew deliberately. So anyway, the point being is that once we see that Luke is clearly copying Matthew, and there's many examples of this, tons of evidence for this, we don't need Q. Like, what does Q explain? Why would we have this extra epicycle, this extra thing? You don't need it. There's nothing there. And so there's a lot of other reasons why I think Q is just a really bad theory. But that's the main reason. Is it's just useless. It doesn't explain anything, and there's no evidence for it. We have no independent corroboration that there ever was such a document.
Yeah, and Luke represented the AMA too, the woman with the issue of blood. He conveniently left out that line about there was no doctor that could help her.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. I haven't looked at that one, but yeah.
Yeah. He didn't want doctors to look bad, so that line it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's not there in Luke. I say, oh, how convenient for a physician to think that way. So yeah.
If Luke was a physician, I don't really buy the argument that the author of Luke was a physician, though.
Right. He might have worked for the AMA. What do you think? Why did he leave out that line about the doctors? I mean, come on, guys.
Well, Luke is very definitely pro-elite. So he's definitely a member of that upper class. So he would have that attitude that let's not diss on doctors.
Yeah.
Like he wouldn't have to himself be a doctor to be on that wavelength, basically.
Right. Well, you say in the book that we learn a great deal about how to construct a gospel from the Nag Hammadi library, from those texts. What do those texts teach us about how the gospels are put together?
Yeah, famous example. So for people who don't know, the Nag Hammadi find, it's named after a town in Egypt where this pot was found, supposedly, this is the story. This pot was found in which had been stuffed a bunch of illicit gospels and other Christian literature, unorthodox, non-orthodox, heretical, scandalous literature from the Middle Ages. So someone in, I think 7th century, 8th century, somewhere around there. So basically smack in the middle of Middle Ages in Egypt, someone hurriedly stuffed a bunch of heretical Christian literature into a pot and buried it. And it was recovered like 1945 or something, somewhere around there.
Yeah, that's right. 45.
And so that's called the Nag Hammadi texts, and a bunch of these are all medieval texts. So there's some argument that maybe some of the texts, the manuscripts are medieval, but the texts might date earlier. That's hard to prove. I mean, I'm not entirely convinced by all of that, but it's problematic. But the point is it is an unorthodox text. These are a collection of stuff that would have been definitely scandalous to have. Would have gotten you deep shit if you got caught with it. And so it looks like this is the theory is that someone like the authorities were coming, so someone basically pushed it all into this pot and hid it, and never got back to it. Maybe they got killed for heresy or whatever, but and it was left there. That's the theory anyway. We don't have confirmation of that, but one of the pieces of evidence for this is that whoever this was who pushed all this stuff into the pot was in the middle of fabricating a gospel. Like they weren't finished. Like they were literally in the middle of working on it when they pushed it in. So they just pushed it all in the pot. Like don't worry, I'll get back to that and I'll sort it out. But no, they never sorted it out. They never got back to it. So they left this evidence, and it's called the gospel. It's called the Sophia of Jesus Christ, or the wisdom of Jesus Christ. And what we have, there's this letter, also probably fake, but anyway, there's this letter in there that's not Christian. It might be Jewish, it might be pagan Gnostic, it's not clear, but it's called Eugnostos, which means basically good knowledge, Mr. Good Knowledge, another fake name.
Right.
So there's this letter from Mr. Good Knowledge about mystical reality and stuff. It's nothing's explicitly Christian, but it's all like how the nature of the universe works and stuff like that. And so someone started writing the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the wisdom of Jesus Christ, which is a resurrection dialogue. So like Jesus is risen and he meets the disciples in his resurrected body, and he starts discoursing, like having dialogue with his disciples. And so he's having a conversation with them. The curious thing is that every time Jesus says something in this conversation, it's a direct quote from the Eugnostos letter. They took material from the Eugnostos letter, put it in the mouth of Jesus, created a narrative context for his disciples to interact with him. And they didn't finish. They were halfway done doing this. So we have this example of someone faking a gospel in the middle of the process of it happening. And we have the source text, which is not a gospel text. We can see how they're working. They're using texts and sources and putting things in the mouth of Jesus and fabricating a narrative in which Jesus gets to say them.
Wow.
And if you could keep doing that, why do we assume that that's not how the Gospels were written in the first place? Right? There's no reason to think, honestly, that Mark wasn't written the same way, that he wasn't just taking the letters of Paul, maybe some other letters he had access to, other teachings and stuff from various people, Cynic philosophy. He's got the Moses stories, the Elijah stories. He's got all these source texts, none of which have anything to do with Jesus. And he's fabricating a gospel. He's just putting it into the mouth of Jesus, having Jesus do the same things and so on. He's creating a narrative the same way as this dialogue of, this wisdom of Jesus Christ and so on. So that's one of the Nag Hammadi find is a really, it has that one neat little gem in it that shows us something that we've long suspected and many scholars have argued, but here we have a concrete example of it. So, yeah.
That's pretty awesome, to catch somebody red-handed,
Yeah.
Retroactively red-handed, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it still happens. The gospel of Jesus' wife. Do you know the story of that?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
So it was, found recently, hidden in some archives somewhere. And it was a fragment of this Coptic gospel, medieval gospel, this fragment that has Jesus talking supposedly about his wife, Mary or something. Therefore proving that there was a legend of Jesus having a wife.
Okay.
And it was endorsed by, I think, Karen King of Harvard, or I can't remember. Yeah, I think it was Harvard. They really said, no, this is authentic. We've vetted this. It's authentic. And someone, looked at the text and said, well, hold on. This text is constructed out of a digital Coptic library, which means, it was constructed recently. Therefore, it's a forgery, a recent forgery. And they were able to show this because they're saying, there was a typo in the digital text that's not in the actual text, and the typo is preserved in the forgery, right? So,
oh my goodness.
So this is a big scandal. So Harvard is like, no, that's just a coincidence. It's not indicative. And a bunch of other scholars saying, no, this is definitely a forgery. So eventually there's this reporter this reporter wrote this great article. I can't remember, was it for the New Yorker? I can't remember for who it was for. This reporter just did the total Dan Brown on this thing and researched everything. And they caught the guy. They found the dude and he confessed the forgery.
Okay.
So it's this weird wackadoo guy who made this forgery. And they got all the documentary evidence. So they're basically able to prove that it was a forgery, like just hardcore prove that it was a forgery. Vindicating the scholars who detected it as a forgery earlier. And now, King and Harvard have admitted, yeah, okay, damn it, we were suckered. This is a forgery. So it still happens today, It's 2,000 years, they're still doing it.
Good gracious.
Yeah.
Some people are just desperate, particularly historicists, to prove their point. So here we go, Richard. We've come around full circle now. So, yeah.
I think we have to wrap soon, right?
I think we do. It's about time to wrap. So tell me this. What scholars have adopted your approach to mythicism and are conducting research along the same or similar lines? Or who shows the most promise of continuing your work on the historicity of Jesus?
Well, Raphael Lataster is the one who's done the most directly. The reality is a lot of what's interesting is skirting around the scandalous suggestion that Jesus didn't exist, but picking up side issues, like how the Gospel of Mark is actually a reification of the epistles of Paul, or how, you have Richard Miller as an example.
Okay.
Richard Miller's written a book on how the resurrection stories in the Gospels are definitely mythical, using the same mimesis criteria and the same concepts of the analysis that I've been talking about, how it's all very similar to Romulus narrative and so on. So he's running with it and showing that, but he's not arguing Jesus didn't exist. He's just taking a piece of this and showing that the piece works, that the piece is valid, but not going all the way to the conclusion that Jesus didn't exist. And I see a lot of that happening. So that's going
okay.
on.
All right.
Lataster is the only one who's actually really shown an interest in doing more research on this. There are a few other scholars who want to, but don't want to be known as mythicists. And so I'm not going to name them. So I know there's some people who want to do more on this, but are waiting for their opportunity to be able to do it and get away with it, basically. Really what you're seeing mostly are scholars who are at least saying, you have the critics, but apart from the critics, you have scholars who are saying, okay, I think that's plausible, or who might not necessarily reference me, but will at least say that Jesus' historicity agnosticism is plausible. Conveniently saying this after my peer-reviewed book came out.
Right. Yeah.
Before,
taking the risk. You took all the risks, right?
Yeah. Which I could take the hit. I'm an independent scholar, so they can't do anything to me. So that was the reason why I was able to do it. So yeah. So I know I want there to be more. I want more people to do more of this stuff, even if they do the piecemeal thing. Like take a piece and defend it. You don't have to defend the historicity question. Just do some of these different individual items. Like do more of it. Build up the brickwork so that we can, someone else can come along and then really do a validating study of my work. Even if they improve on my work or correct it or criticize it and get a better version of it, I'm totally on board with this. I want to see it happen.
Wow, great. A lot of people are excited about Raphael Lataster's work. Does he have his PhD yet? I know he was working on it.
Yes. No, he got his PhD a couple years ago. He's currently working on... his main focus right now is William Lane Craig's apologetics, which is actually his area of expertise. Lataster's an expert in that. So I think that's what his next step. But he's also got something on the Jesus myth that's in production, I think going through peer review even. I'm not sure yet. I don't know if it's at that stage. But there's something more coming on the horizon, so be aware of that.
That's great. Now, what's your big project you've got on the horizon?
Well, I don't have any big projects. I'm in contract to do some pop market versions of things I've already done. So I'm doing a shorter version with no footnotes, of historicity of Jesus. Right. Which is going to be called Jesus from Outer Space. And that'll just be like, here's a book to give someone to get them tantalized and excited and interested in this theory. But it's not the full, detailed academic monograph. If you really want to, wrestle with the facts and the questions and all the digressions and, did you think of this? What about this? What about this?
Right.
If you want all of that, that's always going to be on the historicity of Jesus. Nothing's going to replace that on my end, probably. But no, that's what I'm working on now. And next I'm going to do a shorter pop market version of Sense and Goodness Without God, which is
great.
which is worldview theory. It's philosophy of life, not
Right.
historicity stuff. But that's the book-wise, those are my projects. Other than that, I teach a course online every month, so people who are interested in that should check that out.
Okay.
I'm quiet this month, but I start a new course next month, and usually every month I'm teaching something, including historicity of Jesus. People are interested in that, but I do history subjects, philosophy subjects, science, and so on. So people who are interested in that should check it out. On my website, richardcarrier.info, you can do on the right margin, you can click categories and go to classes, and then it'll show you what the latest one is. Or you can just go right to Secular Academy. It's just
right.
Google Secular Academy and find what the latest stuff is and what's going on. Right now, we've got nothing scheduled, but it's definitely, there's going to be a course next month. We're going to get that launched sometime this month. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm blogging. So that's the other thing. So keep an eye on the blogs. The big project right now is the big debate I'm having with Dr. Wallace Marshall of Reasonable Faith. So he's basically one of the soldiers of William Lane Craig.
Boy.
And we're debating the existence of God. And it's a long-term, multi-entry debate, which you can check out on my website. Some of the last entries will be on it and so on. But that's the big thing that's occupying me now, in addition to all the other stuff I'm always doing. So, yeah.
Wow, fantastic. Well, and now remember, all these things we got links to, guys. You can check out Dr. Richard Carrier's works. You can connect with everything, his books, his blogs, all of his latest activities, his website, most importantly, his Patreon. And you can find that all in the description on the video, guys. His Patreon, by the way, I want to mention that because it's a direct way to give you support, Richard. And that's so important to you.
It is. It's Patreon especially is one of the most important income streams I have. So if you really want to keep me going and really basically reward me for the work I'm doing for the world and for you too, you can use the materials that I produce in your arguments, and not just for your own education, but also you can refer people to it and so on. That's what I aim to do. And also there's a lot of perks. If you become a Patreon patron, there's a lot of perks you can get out of that, including access to asking me questions and things like that. So check my Patreon out. You can find a link to my Patreon from richardcarrier.info. You can Google Richard Carrier Patreon and so on to get it. But yeah, people who support me there, I really appreciate it. It's one of the most important things that I get. But also people who take my online courses. That's another really important way to support me too. And you get the benefit. You really get, literally you're paying for a month of my undivided attention to ask me all the possible questions you have on whatever subject is the course subject. So check those out as well.
Richard, good things happen when people get your undivided attention. That's how you got started in this back in 2008 when you asked people, what is it you want me to study? And it was this, everybody wanted you to check out the historicity of Jesus. Yep. And then it just snowballed from there.
Sure enough.
Guys, support Dr. Richard Carrier. Richard, it's been great having you on the show.
It's been awesome. Thanks, Luther.
Oh, man. Thanks so much for sharing so much of yourself and your fine work with us. Can't wait to have you again, but let's let it not be so long, okay?
Sure. Yeah, we'll keep in touch.
Great. Definitely. All right. Well, for Mythvision, Dr. Luther G. Williams, Dr. Richard Carrier is our special guest. Guys, we'll see you next time.